Why was no signal coming through the static? The radio hissed, coughing through broken bursts of static, each crackle scraping against ears already strained from hours of silence. They waited, eyes pressed on the console, on the empty line that should have carried their captain's voice. It didn't. Instead, smoke drifted, slow, curling, carrying the sharp bite of burning insulation, the kind of smell that made even seasoned soldiers shift uncomfortably in their seats because it wasn't just smoke, it was a reminder of fragility. Steel could burn, circuits could die, and somewhere beyond that haze, a person they depended on might already be gone. The youngest among them, Private Hale, whispered it first. She should have called by now. His voice cracked, half swallowed by the mask he clutched too loosely. Nobody answered, not because they didn't agree, but because admitting it out loud felt like betrayal. They sought the captain's signal. The world told them to wait for orders, but what lingered in the silence was heavier than command. It was absence. And yet in that absence she was moving. Captain Elena Ward pressed her shoulder harder against the cold concrete, the wall groaning faintly as another impact shook dust down from somewhere above. The building had once been a school. She could still see a faded mural across the hall, children holding hands beneath a painted sun. War had turned it hollow. Classrooms now reeked of damp gunpowder and scorched wiring. Her breath came shallow, quiet. Every inhale tasted of dust and cordite. She didn't cough, not because her lungs didn't demand it, but because discipline had long ago taught her to lock pain in place. No sound, no weakness. Her radio crackled again, faint voices on the other end, her team waiting. They needed a signal, a confirmation, anything. Her fingers hovered over the transmitter, but she didn't press it, not yet. Because there was something she hadn't told them. The mission had seemed straightforward. Secure the outpost, extract the intel, move before nightfall. That's how it had been briefed, a list of steps laid out like an instruction manual. But War never read the manual. Somewhere between step 2 and 3, the world had shifted sideways. Reinforcements never came. Communications towers burned. The evac chopper turned back. And Elena, with only 4 soldiers under her, was left in a city that had already collapsed inward on itself. She told them it was fine. She told them they adapt, reroute, improvise. But alone, with her back pressed against the wall of that half-collapsed school, she let her mask crack just a little. Because it wasn't fine. It hadn't been fine for months. A scream echoed distantly, not close enough to force her to act, not far enough to ignore. She closed her eyes for a beat. Her mind flashed to another scream, a memory buried but never erased. Her younger brother, Daniel, the day the letter came. The day she told him she'd enlisted. He had screamed not out of anger but out of fear. Fear of losing the only family he had left. She carried that sound with her, tucked deep beneath layers of rank and routine. But in moments like this, alone, smoke filling her lungs, it came back uninvited. And she wondered, for the 100th time, whether she'd chosen service for love of country, or because she'd been running from the guilt of being the one left alive. Back at the command truck, the others argued in hushed tones. "She's late," Private Hale whispered again. Staff Sergeant Moreno cut him off with a sharp look. "She's never late. She'll call when she's ready." But his hand tightened on his rifle, the way people tighten a fist when they don't believe their own words. Corporal Diaz leaned against the window, staring at the distant plume of smoke rising from the district where their captain had gone. His jaw clenched. What if? What if nothing? Moreno snapped. "She's Ward, she's not like—" He stopped, swallowed the rest. "Not like who? Not like the last officer they lost, the last time they waited too long." No one wanted to finish that sentence. Elena shifted forward, crawling low until her elbow scraped against broken glass. She didn't flinch. Pain was nothing new. What pulled her focus was the sound, boots on loose debris, measured steps, deliberate. Enemy. Her hand found the rifle at her side. She steadied her breath. She could take them down. She could make the call, rally her team, and they'd move in. But she didn't, not yet. Because timing wasn't just strategy, it was survival. If she moved too soon, if she fired too loud, her team would come running into a trap. She couldn't risk it. So she waited, silent still. And in that stillness she felt it, the loneliness of command. Her soldiers thought they were waiting for her signal. In truth, she was waiting for theirs. Waiting for proof that they still believed she was worth following. The enemy footsteps grew closer. Her heart beat steady, deliberate. She tightened her grip, sighted the shadows shifting through the dust. She could feel the weight of choice pressing heavy. Take the shot now and risk the others. Hold back and risk herself. Her brother's voice came again, Daniel's voice, years younger, cracking with desperation. Why do you always have to be the one to save everyone else? She didn't answer then. She couldn't. But here now the question carved into her chest all over again. Why her? Maybe because silence had always been her companion. She wasn't the loudest, the most decorated, the one who carried speeches in her pocket. She was the one who carried people quietly, through the smoke, through the noise. The one who never let go until everyone else was out. Even if it meant she stayed behind. Back in the truck, the radio crackled again. Moreno leaned forward, hope sparking, then fading just as quickly. Nothing, only static. Private Hale ran his hand over his face, restless. We should go in, we should. Diaz cut him off. You don't rush into fire when you can't see who's inside. You wait. But what if she's? Hale's voice broke. Diaz didn't let him finish. If she's alive, she's fighting for us. If she's not, then we damn well don't throw ourselves in just to follow her. Moreno turned toward him, jaw tight. You don't know her. Diaz stared back, eyes hard. Then tell me, what is it about her that makes you believe she'll come out of this? Moreno didn't answer right away. He thought of the first time he met her, the quiet way she'd stood in the briefing room, overlooked by everyone until she spoke. Not loudly, but with a weight that made people pause. She wasn't larger than life. She was just unshakable in the little things, the kind of person who remembered every name, who carried the dead in silence and the living with patience. She doesn't shine in the clear air, Moreno finally said, almost to himself. She shines in the smoke. That's where she belongs. The enemy stepped closer. Elena's finger hovered on the trigger. And then she didn't pull. She slipped back, retreating into deeper shadow, lungs burning from restraint. Because courage wasn't always pulling the trigger. Sometimes it was holding fire, waiting until the exact second when silence spoke louder than a gunshot. The radio pressed cold against her palm. She considered pressing it, sending her team the signal they waited for. But her lips barely moved as she whispered into the smoke. Not yet. Why didn't she call? The question beat in every chest inside the command truck. The radio sat between them like a wounded animal, alive with noise but saying nothing. Smoke rolled across the city in thick, curling sheets. Somewhere out there, beyond the ash and the silence, their captain was moving. But they didn't know if toward them or away. Elena stayed pressed in the dark. Dust clung to her eyelashes, sweat ran down her neck, but her body was still as the broken desks scattered across the classroom floor. She counted breaths, counted steps. The enemy was close now, close enough that she could hear the creak of leather straps, the rattle of gear shifting with each stride. Her rifle was steady, her heart was not. Because her mind, traitor that it was, pulled her elsewhere. Back to the day she first put on the uniform. Back to the mirror in her childhood bedroom, her brother standing in the doorway, holding a photo of their parents, both already gone. Why, he asked, his voice had been so small then, why can't you just stay? She hadn't answered, not truthfully. The truth was messy, tangled between duty and escape, pride and fear. She told him it was about service, about honor. But in her heart, she knew she was leaving because she couldn't stand still in a world that kept crumbling. And now, years later, crouched in a school-turned battlefield, she wondered if Daniel had been right all along. The footsteps stopped, silence. Elena froze. A shadow shifted just beyond the doorway. A figure stood in the dust, searching. He didn't speak, didn't rush, just waited like he knew someone was there. Her finger tensed on the trigger. And then a sound cut through, a metallic snap, faint but sharp. The soldier adjusted his weapon, oblivious to the tiny noise it made. For Elena, it was a signal, a pattern she'd been trained to recognize, careless, unaware, vulnerable. She could end it, she could fire. But something else held her still, a weight in her chest, heavier than the rifle itself. Because she wasn't just deciding whether to kill. She was deciding what kind of leader her soldiers would remember when this was over. A captain who rushed, or one who endured. In the truck, Private Hale's nerves snapped first. "I'm not waiting anymore." He grabbed his rifle, stood, eyes wild. "She's out there, alone, if we just sit here." Moreno's hand clamped on his arm, steel in his grip. "You walk out that door without orders, you're not saving her. You're abandoning her. She doesn't need panic, she needs faith." Hale wrenched free, trembling. "Faith doesn't stop bullets." Diaz, still by the window, exhaled slow. "Neither does fear." Their eyes locked, the kind of stare that carried unspoken history, too many losses, too many friends who ran before thinking. Hale's chest heaved, Moreno's jaw clenched, Diaz's silence pressed like weight. Then from the corner, Specialist Reeves, the quietest of them all, finally spoke. "She told me once," he murmured, almost to himself. "In training," she said, "if you don't hear from me, it doesn't mean I'm gone, it means I'm working." The others turned toward him. Reeves didn't meet their eyes. He just stared at the smoke. Inside the school, Elena shifted her weight. The enemy turned, scanning. His boots scraped the ground. That single sound gave her what she needed. She slipped deeper into the shadows, circling wide, avoiding the glass that would betray her. Her body moved slow, patient. Her heart screamed to run. Her mind whispered to wait. And in the waiting, memories returned. Her first command. The first time she'd stood before a team, every face young, expectant, waiting for her words. She hadn't known what to say. She wasn't a speech giver. She wasn't fire and thunder. So she told them the truth. "I don't promise victory. I promise I won't leave you." That was all. That was enough. And now, in the smoke of this broken city, she had to prove it again. The enemy soldier paused, tilted his head, listening. Then, without warning, he moved fast, cutting toward the hallway where Elena had been seconds before. She stayed silent, motionless, invisible in the ruin. When his back turned, her rifle rose. Her breath steadied. The world narrowed to the iron sights, the curve of his shoulder, the beat of her own heart. One squeeze, that's all it would take. But she hesitated. Not out of fear, out of calculation. Killing him now would spark noise, draw others, bring fire down on her team before they were ready. So she lowered the rifle, let him walk. And with that choice, she carried the heavier burden. Back at the truck, Moreno leaned forward, elbows on knees, staring at the dead radio. His voice was low, almost prayer. "Ward, what the hell are you doing out there?" No one answered, no one could. But in their silence, a truth grew. They weren't just waiting for a signal. They were waiting to see if the quiet strength of one woman could hold together the fragile courage of 4 men. Elena finally moved, rising from her crouch. Her knees ached, her lungs burned, but her steps were steady. She slipped deeper into the school, past chalkboards smeared with ash, past broken desks that once held children's dreams. And she whispered to herself, not for comfort but for anchor. Not yet. Because she wasn't ready to signal. Not until she knew her team's lives were worth the risk of her voice. The radio stayed silent. Her courage did not. Why did she hesitate? The question lingered in the minds of her team, though none of them had seen her decision. They only knew the silence stretched longer than before, a silence that pressed against their nerves like a blade held too close to skin. They wanted her voice, they wanted command, but all they had was static. Alina moved deeper into the skeleton of the school. Her boots touched down softly, heel to toe, careful with every step. The floor creaked under old weight, echoes bouncing down empty halls where children once ran. She could still imagine the sound, laughter, sneakers skidding across polished tile. The ghosts of innocence. She adjusted the strap on her shoulder, rifle resting steady. The air here was thicker, smoke and plaster choking her throat. She swallowed hard, no cough, no sound. Discipline stitched every muscle. Ahead, faint light seeped through cracks in the boarded windows. Beyond those slats, the city groaned. Fires snapped in the distance. A low drone of engines swept across the horizon. The enemy wasn't gone. They were circling, waiting. She stopped beside a doorway, leaning slightly against the frame. Her breath caught, but not from exhaustion, from memory. Her father's voice. It came as it always did when she found herself at crossroads. Soft, measured, not commanding, but steady. Alina, sometimes courage isn't loud. It's not the charge, it's the weight. It's the breath you hold when no one sees you. She had been 12 when he said that, sitting in a field after her first failed track meet. She had wanted to run faster. He had told her to learn stillness first. Now, years later, crouched in a half-ruined school, his words returned. Stillness, patience, quiet courage. Back in the truck, Private Hale couldn't sit anymore. His knee bounced, his hands restless, sweat shining on his forehead. "I can't do this," he muttered. "I can't just sit here while she—" "While she what?" Diaz cut in, his tone sharp. "You don't even know what's happening out there. None of us do." Hale snapped his head around, voice rising. "Exactly. And what if that silence is because she's down? What if we're wasting time?" Reeves, still leaning forward with his hands folded, spoke quietly. "Or what if she's alive because she's silent?" The argument froze there. Hale's breath came heavy, his eyes darting between them. Moreno's gaze stayed fixed on the radio, hard, unblinking. "She's not done," Moreno said, voice low. "Not until she says she's done." But inside, even he wondered how long silence could stretch before it became absence. Alina crouched low, sliding into another classroom. Chairs overturned, chalk dust thick in the air, sunlight catching floating particles like tiny sparks. She scanned corners, checked doorways. Empty. And then faint, a sound, not boots, not metal, softer, fragile. Breathing. Her rifle snapped up, her body still. The breath came from behind a desk near the window, slow, uneven, human. She stepped closer. The figure shifted, trying to shrink lower, and when Alina moved around the corner, the shape resolved. A child. A girl no older than 8, clutching a tattered backpack to her chest, eyes wide with fear and dust streaking her cheeks. Alina froze. For a moment, the war fell away. She saw her own reflection in that face, the child she had once been, crouched in hallways when her own city cracked under chaos, waiting for someone, anyone, to lead her out. The girl didn't speak, didn't cry, just stared, trembling. Alina lowered her rifle. Slowly, carefully, she knelt. Her voice, when it came, was softer than she knew it could be. "It's all right." The girl flinched. Alina slid her hand across the floor, palm open, fingers steady. She didn't reach for her. She simply offered presence. The girl's breath stuttered. Her eyes flicked to the door, then back to Alina. Trust was fragile here, as fragile as glass. But after a long, heavy moment, the girl edged forward, just enough that her backpack brushed Alina's glove. Alina's throat tightened. She wanted to promise safety. She wanted to promise survival, but promises were heavy things. She couldn't bear to break another. So she simply nodded, "Stay close." In the truck, Diaz leaned forward suddenly, pointing out the window, smoke shifting. They crowded toward the glass. Sure enough, the plume in the distance bent east, carried by wind, but mixed in the curl of black was something else, flashes, muzzle bursts. "Contact," Moreno muttered. Hale gripped his rifle tighter. That's her, it has to be. Diaz shook his head. Could be anyone. But what if it's her? Hale demanded. We sit here while she's fighting alone. Moreno turned sharply. And if we run into a trap, if we all die charging in blind, tell me, who does that help? The silence afterward wasn't agreement, it was survival. Inside the school, Alina guided the girl through debris, moving slow, silent. Every creak of wood made her heart slam against her ribs. She kept the child close, one hand hovering, not touching but ready. Each hallway stretched longer, shadows deeper. Every doorway threatened. And then a sound behind them. Boots, multiple, closing fast. Alina's body stiffened. Her mind raced. Too many to fight, too close to flee. Her eyes scanned the room, sharp, urgent. Desks, rubble, broken shelves, nowhere safe. Until she saw it. A crawl space, low and half-collapsed, tucked beneath a fallen beam, small enough for a child. She crouched, met the girl's wide eyes. In there, she whispered. The girl shook her head, clutched her backpack tighter. Alina's chest ached. Listen to me, you hide, no sound, no matter what. Still the girl didn't move, tears welled. Alina placed her hand lightly on the child's shoulder, steady, firm. I'll come back. The words burned her tongue. She hated them because she didn't know if they were true. But the girl nodded, finally, and crawled into the space. Her small body vanished into shadow. Only her wide eyes remained, watching. Alina turned, rifle ready. Boots drew closer. Her breath steadied. Her father's words returned. Courage is the breath you hold when no one sees you. She exhaled once, quiet, final. And she waited in the smoke. Back in the truck, Reeves finally broke the silence. You ever wonder why she never raises her voice? Hale looked at him, frowning. What does that have to do with anything? Reeves shrugged slightly, gaze still distant. People think leadership, about shouting orders. But her silence, it makes you listen harder, makes you pay attention. She doesn't need noise to carry weight. Diaz leaned back, arms crossed. Or maybe she just doesn't trust words. Moreno shot him a look, but he didn't argue, because maybe Diaz was right. Maybe silence was her shield. Still, the question haunted all of them. If she never called, how long would they wait? Alina crouched behind the last intact wall. Boots pounded closer. Voices now foreign, clipped, sharp. She couldn't understand the words, but she didn't need to. Tone was universal. They were hunting. Her grip tightened. Her mind cataloged options. Engage, evade, sacrifice sound for safety. But as the first figure turned the corner, silhouetted in smoke, something inside her shifted. Not fear, not anger, something quieter. Resolve. Because the girl in the crawl space wasn't just a survivor, she was a mirror, a reminder of who Alina had once been, and who she refused to abandon. So she raised her rifle, eyes steady, heart silent. The smoke curled around her, hiding everything except the fire in her gaze. And for the first time, she knew, her team wasn't just waiting for her signal. The city was. The smoke had thinned by the time the first light of morning reached the fractured horizon. The air smelled of scorched metal, gunpowder, and something less tangible, fear, lingering in the silence after chaos. Captain Alara stood at the eastern barricade, her shoulders squared though her body ached with exhaustion. She had not slept in over 30 hours. The dark crescents beneath her eyes told the story of a soldier who refused rest while others leaned on her strength. Her hands were blackened from ash and oil, fingers raw from gripping steel and stone in the heat of battle. Yet when she pressed them against the cool earth of the barricade, she felt alive. Every beat of her heart reminded her that she had outlasted another storm. Every breath proved she had denied the enemy's attempt to silence her people. Behind her, the survivors stirred in what remained of the settlement. Children clung to parents who wore hollow stares. Medics worked silently, patching wounds with dwindling supplies. The sound of hammering began again as engineers tried to rebuild portions of the collapsed wall. Life, though fragile, was asserting itself in defiance of destruction. Alara looked back, scanning the weary faces. She knew what they were searching for: reassurance, a sign that they had not fought for nothing. She had given them orders through the long night, her voice steady though her spirit wavered in private moments. They followed her not because she was invincible, but because she had stood unbroken when everything else crumbled. Still in her chest, the weight of command pressed harder than the stone walls she leaned upon. At dawn's first gathering, the Council of Defense huddled inside a scorched command tent. Maps lay across a bent metal table, edges singed where fire had licked too close. "They'll return," said General Corrin, his voice a gravelly rumble. He was a seasoned fighter with half his hair turned white and scars that marked battles no history book remembered. His eyes never left the map as he circled positions with a cracked stylus. "They probed last night, tested our strength. The next strike will come heavier, sharper." A murmur passed among the others. Some clenched their jaws, others bowed their heads. Ilara listened, but her gaze wandered to the eastern ridgeline drawn on the parchment. She interrupted softly, "They'll come from the west." The room stilled. Corrin's eyes flicked to her, hard with skepticism. "What makes you think so, Captain? They always push from the east. They know our strong wall lies opposite." Ilara stepped closer to the map, tapping the western edge. "Because that's where the smoke lingered longest this morning. Their transports dropped more than we saw last night." And she paused, recalling the movement she'd traced in the fire-lit distance. Their scouts circled wide, not toward the barricade, but beyond it. They're hunting for weakness. The silence stretched. Then one of the younger strategists, voice hesitant, spoke. "She's right. The wind carried sound, metal striking rock where no debris fell. West." Corrin grunted, reluctantly conceding. He scratched a thick circle on the western flank. "Then we prepare for that. Captain, you'll lead the defense there." The assignment was both a recognition and a burden. She accepted it with a nod, though inside her chest a familiar ache spread, the knowledge that every life on that flank would weigh against her if the defense faltered. When the council dispersed, Ilara walked alone through the camp. The sun climbed slowly, washing the ruins in pale gold. It revealed the scars of battle in stark detail, the blackened bones of houses, twisted beams jutting like broken ribs, the charred ground where gardens once bloomed. Children had drawn shapes in the dirt with sticks, circles, stars, rough sketches of ships they imagined might carry them to safety. Ilara stopped, watching as one girl traced a figure with wings, standing tall above tiny shapes that seemed to bow beneath it. The child looked up at her and smiled, the innocence cutting through Ilara's exhaustion. "Is that you, Captain?" the girl asked. Ilara's throat tightened. She crouched down, brushing her fingers across the dirt drawing. "No," she whispered gently. "That's all of us, standing together." The girl beamed as if reassured, then darted back to her companions. Ilara rose slowly, her gaze lingering on the wings. Perhaps they did not see her doubts. Perhaps they only saw the strength she pretended to hold. By midday, preparations filled the camp. Barricades of stone and metal scraps rose along the western edge. Fighters drilled despite fatigue, their movements slower but steadier, driven by sheer determination. Medics organized supplies in shaded corners, rationing what little remained. Ilara moved among them, not as a commander above, but as a soldier beside them. She lifted stone, hammered nails, steadied trembling hands. Each gesture reminded them that she carried the same burdens. Each word she offered, quiet, firm, never exaggerated, gave them courage. Yet when she returned to her quarters, the solitude pressed down. She removed her gloves, staring at the cuts and burns on her hands. They were hands that had built, protected, destroyed, and held lives slipping away. She thought of her family, faces long gone, taken by wars that had bled into one another. She thought of the oath she swore, not to glory, but to shield the defenseless. In the dimness, she allowed herself to feel what she never showed: fear. Not fear of death, she had faced that too many times, but fear of failing those who trusted her light. She pressed her forehead against the cool metal wall. "Give me enough strength," she whispered to no one, to everyone, to the echoes of those who had fallen. "Just one more night." The warning came with the fall of evening. Scouts raced back, breath ragged, faces pale. "They're coming," one gasped. "Hundreds West Ridge armored." The camp reacted with controlled urgency. Bells rang. Fighters grabbed weapons, assembling at their posts. Families were ushered into shelters dug deep into the hillside. The air thickened with anticipation, hearts pounding in unison. Alara stood at the front of the western line, her silhouette cut against the darkening sky. The enemy's march echoed faintly across the valley, an approaching storm of metal and boots. Her second-in-command, Lieutenant Rin, stepped beside her. He was young, eyes sharp but shadowed by the weight of loss. "Captain, what if we can't hold them?" Alara looked at him, steady and calm despite the storm within her. "Then we make them remember that we stood." Her voice carried no boast, no false hope, only the quiet steel of conviction. Rin nodded, shoulders straightening. The soldiers nearby overheard, and the murmur of fear faded into the silence of resolve. The first explosions shook the ridge, brilliant flashes tearing the dusk apart. The enemy descended like a tide, armored figures glinting in the firelight. Their weapons roared, shredding earth and stone. Alara raised her arm, signaling, "Hold." The defenders braced behind the barricade, gripping weapons, knuckles white. The air filled with the scream of incoming shells, the crack of rifles, the roar of engines. Then, when the enemy drew close enough, Alara dropped her arm. "Now!" A volley of fire erupted from the defenders. Arrows tipped with fire streaked into the sky, mingling with bursts of plasma. Stones launched from crude catapults smashed into enemy ranks. The ridge lit up with fury as both sides clashed in a storm of destruction. Alara fought at the center, her blade flashing, her rifle steady. She moved like one who had nothing left to lose but everything left to protect. The enemy pressed harder, relentless, but each time they advanced, they met the wall of her will. Hours blurred, the night screamed with chaos, barricades cracked, soldiers fell. The ground became slick with fire and shadow. But still she stood. As the moon dipped low, the western barricade burned but did not break. The enemy withdrew, dragging their wounded, leaving shattered machines behind. Their retreat was not a victory, only a pause. Yet to the defenders it was proof they had endured once more. The soldiers collapsed in exhaustion, some weeping, some silent. Families emerged cautiously, eyes searching for loved ones. Medics rushed among the wounded, their hands trembling but determined. Alara remained at her post, armor scorched, face streaked with soot. She looked over the smoking battlefield, her body trembling with exhaustion, her heart heavy with the names of those lost. Behind her, a whisper carried through the camp. "She's still standing." The words passed from voice to voice, not shouted, not sung, but spoken with reverence. It was not her rank they honored, nor her strength alone. It was her refusal to bow, her courage that burned quietly in the ashes of mourning. And though she felt the weight of sorrow pressing deeper into her chest, Alara allowed herself a single breath of relief. For tonight, they still lived. But she knew the war was far from over. The horizon still promised fire. The morning after the Western Ridge battle was not filled with triumph. It was quiet, too quiet for a place where the living had survived. Smoke drifted lazily across the valley floor, rising from the shattered machines the enemy had abandoned. The defenders moved like shadows, repairing, burying, cleaning wounds. Every gesture seemed slower, heavier. Captain Alara walked among them, her boots crunching over broken glass and scorched soil. She carried no visible injuries, yet her movements betrayed the weight she bore. Every soldier lost the night before pressed on her chest like a stone. She remembered their faces, the way they had looked to her as the last order fell from her lips. Her second-in-command, Lieutenant Rin, limped at her side, his arm in a sling. "You should rest," he said, voice tight with fatigue. "So should you," she replied evenly, though her tone softened when she caught the stubborn fire in his eyes. He was young, but after last night she knew he carried scars no surgeon could reach. The camp held together barely. Supplies dwindled further. Ammunition was rationed with desperate precision. Every remaining fighter carried wounds, visible or hidden. And yet, despite their condition, no one spoke of surrender. Because they had not seen Alara surrender. By midday, the Defense Council gathered again. The tent was quieter this time, as if the very walls feared the sound of what they must discuss. Maps stretched before them, but the ink seemed faded, untrustworthy. General Corin broke the silence first. "We can't endure another night like that. Reinforcements should have arrived by now. Where is the captain's signal?" A hollow pause followed. The captain he meant was not Alara. It was Captain Drellin, who had been assigned to signal the fleet orbiting far above, calling for relief, for supplies, for salvation. His signal should have cut through the stars days ago, yet no help had come. The council's eyes shifted uneasily. Alara said nothing, but the words pressed against her throat. She had suspected the truth since the first night passed without aid. The signal had failed, or worse, the fleet had abandoned them. Corin slammed his fist against the table, voice rising. "Without confirmation, we're blind. We fight here as if the stars themselves have turned their backs." Another officer whispered bitterly, "Maybe they have." The council splintered into murmurs, arguments of retreat, whispers of betrayal, calculations of survival. Through it all, Alara remained silent, her gaze fixed on the burned edges of the map. Finally, she spoke. "If no signal is coming, then we stop waiting for rescue." The room stilled. Corin's eyes burned. "What do you suggest, Captain? That we fight alone until the last child starves?" Her voice was low, steady, yet carried enough weight to silence the murmurs. "I suggest that we make ourselves the signal, not with transmitters, with our defiance. Let them see smoke rising from a battlefield they could not take. Let them hear our names carried by those who survive. If we must fall, then let the enemy spend their strength breaking us, so the world remembers it was not easy." No one argued, for though her words were bleak, they held a truth the others lacked. Later, when the council dispersed, Alara stood at the ridge's edge, staring across the battlefield. The sun caught on twisted armor, casting long shadows across the valley floor. Rin approached quietly. "You didn't tell them what you really think," he said. Alara didn't look at him. "What I think doesn't matter. They need something they can hold on to." He frowned. "And what about you? What do you hold on to?" For a long moment she said nothing. Then finally she whispered, "The faces I can still protect." Rin studied her, then nodded. He understood. He would not press further. That evening the camp prepared again. Fires were lit not just for warmth, but to send smoke curling into the twilight sky, a defiant message that they still stood. Fighters repaired weapons, even those barely functional. Children carried buckets of water to fill trenches. Old men sharpened blades that had not seen use in decades. It was not an army anymore. It was a people shaping themselves into resistance. Alara walked among them, her presence enough to draw nods, murmurs of reassurance. They whispered her name as though it carried power. Some began calling her not just captain, but guardian. She discouraged it at first, but the title spread anyway, spoken softly in the way one speaks of a candle in the dark. But in her own heart, doubt gnawed. She returned to her quarters and sat on the cot, her hands trembling as she removed her armor piece by piece. The silence pressed close. She reached for the small tin she kept in her pack, a box containing a single photograph, faded and frayed. Her younger brother smiled from it, eyes bright, hair tousled. He had died in a different war, years ago, before she had risen in rank. She traced his face with her fingertip. "I don't know how much longer I can do this," she whispered, "but if you were here, you tell me not to stop." Her voice broke, but no one was there to hear. The night came without warning. Explosions ripped across the eastern wall, the side they had once considered strong. Enemy artillery screamed into the camp, tearing apart shelters, igniting supplies. Screams pierced the night as chaos erupted. Alara raced through the camp, issuing orders. "Hold the east wall, evacuate the shelters, keep the children underground." Her voice cut through the terror, sharp and unyielding. Rin caught up with her, shouting over the din. "They've split their forces, east and west both, trying to crush us in the middle." Alara's mind spun, calculating. They had no reserves left. Every fighter was already committed. To divide now was to weaken both fronts. She made her decision. "I'll take the east, you hold the west." Rin's eyes widened. "You'll be surrounded." "Then I'll give them something to surround," she snapped, but her tone softened an instant later. "Trust me, Rin, hold the west, do not break." He hesitated, then saluted sharply before running toward his post. Alara turned eastward, drawing her blade and rifle, her silhouette cutting through the firelit chaos. The eastern wall burned, collapsing under relentless assault. Enemy machines pressed forward, their engines howling like beasts. The defenders fell back step by step, their lines faltering. Then Alara appeared among them. Her presence steadied the soldiers as if an invisible hand gripped their spines. She shouted commands, her voice carrying above the roar. "Stand together. Use the rubble for cover. Aim for the joints." Her blade flashed as she cut down armored soldiers, moving with precision and fury. Her rifle cracked, each shot finding its mark. The defenders rallied, forming around her like a shield around a flame. The enemy pressed harder, waves of steel and fire crashing against their line. But for every step they gained, Alara pushed them back. She climbed atop the broken wall, standing tall against the storm, her figure framed by fire and smoke. And in that moment, the defenders saw more than a captain. They saw the signal they had been waiting for, not from the sky, but from the ground beneath their feet. Hours bled away in screams and fire. The enemy did not falter, but neither did she. By dawn, the eastern wall was nothing but ash and rubble, yet it still held. The defenders stood bruised, bloodied, but alive. The enemy withdrew once more, dragging their dead. Alara collapsed against the broken stones, her chest heaving, her arms trembling. Medics rushed to her side, but she waved them away. She looked out across the battlefield, where smoke curled into the pale morning sky. The fleet had not come, the captain's signal had failed. But in the rising smoke, she realized something profound. Perhaps the galaxy would never hear their plea. Perhaps no help would come. But those who lived here had seen something greater than a signal. They had seen her courage, burning quietly in the smoke. The morning after the eastern wall, the camp stirred like a wounded animal. Soldiers limped through rubble, dragging metal to reinforce barricades that no longer existed. Children emerged from underground shelters, eyes wide, faces streaked with ash. They were alive, but they had seen too much. And in the center of it all, Captain Alara stood motionless, her gaze fixed on the horizon. Why were the enemy withdrawing each dawn? Why hadn't they finished them when they had the chance? That question pressed like a blade against her thoughts. The answer would come, but not in the way she expected. The council reconvened inside the battered command tent. Smoke still seeped through a rent in the canvas roof, curling in lazy spirals above their heads. General Corrin's voice was gravel, sharp with exhaustion. "Another night like that and we break. Supplies are gone, ammunition, barely enough for a skirmish." An officer muttered, "We can't keep this up, not without reinforcements." Corrin slammed his palm down. "Reinforcements aren't coming. Either Captain Drellin failed to send the signal or the fleet has abandoned us. Stop waiting." All eyes turned toward Alara, She didn't flinch. "We can't win a war of attrition," she said quietly, "but we can win a war of meaning." Confusion spread across the table. She continued, "The enemy isn't pulling back because they fear our weapons. They're pulling back because they don't understand why we still stand. They thought we'd be broken by now, but we're not. That unnerves them." Corin frowned. "You think their retreat is hesitation?" "I think," she said, "that they're preparing something different, something worse. But hesitation means they still fear what we represent. That fear is our weapon." Silence followed. Finally Rin spoke, voice low but firm. "Then we sharpen it." Alara gave a single nod. "Yes, but we'll need more than defense, we'll need to strike." The council erupted in protest. Striking the enemy seemed madness with what little strength remained. But her words planted a seed, and even in doubt, they could not shake it free. That night, as the camp dimmed into uneasy rest, Alara sat alone on the ridge. She pressed her palms against her knees, grounding herself in the cold stone. Her brother's photograph lay in her lap. She had studied it so many times the edges were soft as cloth. "I don't know how much longer I can carry them," she whispered into the dark. "But maybe it's not about carrying. Maybe it's about standing so they can rise." The wind carried no answer. Only the distant sound of shifting rubble, like the city itself was listening. The attack came 3 days later. But it wasn't like the others. This time the enemy didn't storm the walls or break the defenses head-on. Instead, they set fires. Dozens of them. Oil-soaked cloths hurled into shelters. Arrows tipped with flame cutting across the night sky. The camp ignited in chaos, screams tearing the night as families scrambled from burning shelters. Alara bolted from her tent, shouting orders. "Water lines, form a chain, protect the stores." Her voice cut through the roar, but panic still spread faster than obedience. Rin appeared at her side, face streaked with soot. "They're targeting civilians." "I know," she snapped, scanning the blaze. "That's the point." This wasn't war, it was terror. The enemy had stopped trying to break soldiers. Now they wanted to break hope. Through the chaos, Alara spotted a group of children trapped in a burning shelter. The roof sagged, flames licking across its beams. Without hesitation, she sprinted toward it. Rin shouted after her, but she didn't pause. She kicked through the door, smoke choking her lungs. Inside, 3 children cowered, eyes wide with terror. "Alara," one gasped. Her name had spread even to the youngest. She dropped low, coughing, motioning with sharp gestures. "Stay down, crawl." She pulled the smallest child into her arms, ushering the others toward the door. Heat seared her back as the roof groaned overhead. With a final shove, she forced them through the doorway just as the beams collapsed behind her. She stumbled out, hair singed, uniform smoldering but alive. The children clung to her legs, sobbing. Around them, soldiers and civilians alike stared, not at the fire, not at the destruction, but at her. And in their eyes she saw it again. That wordless, dangerous thing, belief. By dawn, the fires were mostly contained. Smoke drifted heavy across the camp, stinging every throat. Exhaustion hung thicker than ash. But through the wreckage, whispers spread, of how she had walked into fire, how she had carried children from the flames. Alara listened to none of it. She sat alone, coughing quietly, chest tight. Her body screamed for rest, but her mind wouldn't relent. They were losing ground every night, yet somehow the people were gaining something else, a conviction. It terrified her more than the enemy. Because belief could lift them, yes, but it could also make them blind. What if she failed? What if, in the end, she was only human and the weight of their trust crushed her? She pressed her forehead against her knees, trembling silently. No one saw. That evening, Rin approached her with an expression she couldn't read. "They're calling you the signal now," he said. She lifted her head slowly. "The what?" "The signal. They say even if the fleet never comes, you're the call they'll follow." Her chest tightened. That's dangerous. It's hope, he countered softly, and right now it's all they have. She stared at him, wanting to argue, wanting to remind him that hope placed in one person was fragile, breakable, but the look in his eyes stopped her. He wasn't speaking as a lieutenant. He was speaking as someone who had nearly broken and who had been held together by her quiet strength. She swallowed hard. Then I can't falter. Rin's hand touched her shoulder briefly, then fell away. You won't. Days bled together. The enemy shifted tactics again, starving them. Supply lines were cut, wells poisoned. Every day rations grew thinner, water scarcer. Hunger gnawed at the camp. Children's cries grew weaker. Soldiers grew gaunt, eyes hollow. Desperation clawed at them. Arguments broke out in the food lines. Knives flashed in the shadows. The enemy didn't need to kill them. They were unraveling themselves. And still no signal came. One night, Alara walked the camp in silence, moving past the wounded who whispered her name like prayer, past the hungry who clutched her sleeve, begging for reassurance, past the guards who straightened as she passed, masking their fear with discipline. She felt all of it, every touch, every stare, every weight. And when she reached the ridge again, she finally allowed herself to break. Her knees buckled. She sank to the ground, hands pressed to her face. I can't do this alone, she whispered into the night. I'm not a signal, I'm just tired. The silence answered, but then faint, unexpected, she heard footsteps. She lifted her head to see an old woman approach, wrapped in a tattered shawl. One of the civilians, her face lined, her eyes tired but steady. The woman knelt beside her without a word and placed a small piece of bread into her hand. You've carried us, the woman said softly. Let us carry you. Alara stared at the bread, her throat tightening. And in that moment she understood. She wasn't alone, she had never been. The signal wasn't her. It was all of them. The mountain air was thin, each breath a fight, as Alina crouched behind a jagged wall of stone. Dawn was crawling across the horizon, smearing the peaks with pale light, but there was no beauty left in her eyes, only exhaustion, grit, and the weight of choices she could no longer take back. She had survived the night, barely. The storm of gunfire and explosions had painted the valley below in smoke and flame, but now there was a quietness, eerie and suffocating. The silence didn't mean peace. It meant the enemy was regrouping, plotting, waiting for the final strike. Alina tightened her grip on the battered rifle in her hands. It wasn't even her weapon. It had belonged to a fallen ally, one she had dragged behind cover hours ago, whispering a prayer she wasn't sure anyone had heard. Her muscles trembled with fatigue, her uniform torn, dried blood streaking across her forearm. Yet, for all her weakness, her resolve had hardened into something unshakable. She had one mission left, one purpose. Protect the survivors, hold the line. Even if it cost her everything. Far below in the valley, the remnants of her unit were huddled in the ruins of what had once been a safe house. Half were wounded, the others too numb to even whisper. They looked to her not with orders, but with unspoken faith. She wasn't their highest-ranking officer. She wasn't even supposed to be here. But somewhere in the chaos of last night, leadership had shattered, and all eyes had turned to her, the woman who kept standing when the world fell apart. Now she carried not only her life, but theirs. Her earpiece crackled faintly, static, then a voice thin and distant. Alina, come in, do you copy? It was command, their signal fractured by interference. She pressed her hand to the side of her helmet. This is Vega, she whispered, her voice hoarse. I'm here. Status. She hesitated. How could she explain it? That their forces were broken, scattered, bleeding into the earth. That every step she took felt like walking through ghosts. We're holding, she finally said, for now. There was silence on the line, and she knew command understood the truth buried in her words. Reinforcements weren't coming. Not in time. Alina, the voice returned, steady but heavy. "The satellite confirms movement. They're sending another wave. Heavy armor drones. You won't be able to hold much longer." Her chest tightened. She knew. She had seen the shadows shifting across the ridges, felt the tremor of machines in the ground. "Extract isn't possible," the voice continued. "The skis are locked down. The only thing left is the signal. You know what must be done." The signal. The encrypted beacon hidden deep in the mountainside, designed as a last resort. If activated, it would broadcast their location and the truth of what had happened here to the world. But activating it meant staying behind, holding out long enough for the data to transmit. It meant sacrifice. Her throat ached as she swallowed. "I understand," she whispered. The line went dead, leaving her with the echo of her own heartbeat. For a long moment she just sat there, the rifle across her knees, staring at the pale sky. She thought of home, of her mother's hands brushing hair from her forehead when she was a child, of her father's voice teaching her to ride a bike, of her sister's laughter echoing down the hallway of a house that probably didn't even stand anymore. She thought of the people she had saved, the children she had carried from burning villages, the wounded she had shielded with her own body, the friends she had buried with trembling hands. Her life had been made of sacrifice, piece by piece, until there was nothing left of the girl she once was. And now she was asked to give the final piece. She stood slowly, every joint screaming in protest. The signal chamber was hidden in the cliffside, a few hundred meters up. If she could reach it, if she could hold out long enough, maybe their story would not die here. She looked back down the valley one last time. The survivors stirred weakly, some raising their eyes to her. She forced herself to smile, faint but steady. "Stay low," she called softly. "Stay alive, I'll buy you time." None of them argued. None of them asked why. They understood. And that silent understanding was the heaviest blessing she had ever carried. The climb was brutal. Loose rocks cut into her palms, the cold wind biting through every tear in her uniform. Her body screamed for rest, but she kept moving, dragging herself higher and higher, each breath a battlefield. By the time she reached the concealed hatch, her vision was blurring at the edges. She forced it open, metal groaning, and staggered inside. The chamber was small, carved into the mountain itself. At its center stood the beacon, a tower of steel and circuitry, waiting in silence. Her trembling fingers danced across the console, inputting the codes she had memorized but prayed never to use. Lights flickered to life, humming with energy. A countdown began, transmission initializing. 10 minutes, that was all it needed. 10 minutes to hold off the storm. She slung the rifle over her shoulder and stepped back out into the open air. The horizon was no longer pale. It was black, crawling with movement. Shadows poured across the ridges, the metallic glint of armor catching the morning light. Drones buzzed like swarms of insects, their red eyes glowing. The enemy was coming. And she was waiting. Alina crouched low, steadying her breathing. Every shot she fired had to count. Every second she bought was another heartbeat for the ones below. The first wave appeared over the rocks. She squeezed the trigger, the recoil slamming into her shoulder. One target dropped, then another. But for every figure that fell, 10 more emerged. She fired until the rifle clicked empty. Dropping it, she pulled a sidearm, her hands moving with instinct born of training and desperation. Bullets tore through the air, fragments of stone cutting her cheek. Her ears rang, her lungs burned, but she did not stop. Because stopping meant silence. Minutes blurred into eternity. She was bleeding now, a hot line of pain across her ribs where shrapnel had torn through. Her vision swam, her legs buckled, but she forced herself back up against the wall of stone. The beacon's hum vibrated faintly behind her. 5 minutes left. The enemy pressed closer, relentless. She grabbed a grenade from her belt, yanked the pin, and hurled it into the advancing swarm. The explosion lit the ridge, the shockwave throwing her to the ground. She coughed, choking on dust, ears ringing. Her pistol was gone. Her hands shook as she pulled a knife instead, the blade glinting in the broken light. It didn't matter. Weapons were only extensions of will, and her will had not broken. Not yet. 3 minutes. She fought like silence itself, unyielding, invisible, inevitable. Every strike was fueled by memory, every breath a vow. She wasn't fighting for victory anymore. She was fighting for meaning. One last story, carried on the signal, whispered across the stars. Her body was failing. She could feel it, the cold creeping into her veins, the strength seeping from her bones. But she refused to fall. 2 minutes. Her back pressed against the beacon, her knife slick with blood. Hers, theirs, it no longer mattered. She lifted her head, her eyes locking on the horizon. The sun had finally broken through, spilling gold across the peaks. It was beautiful. For the first time in years, she allowed herself to see it. 1 minute. She closed her eyes, and in the silence between breaths she heard them, every voice she had ever saved, every whisper of thanks, every laugh, every cry. They were with her. Not gone, not forgotten. Living because she had given everything. The timer reached 0. The beacon roared, sending its message across the heavens. And in that final moment, as shadows closed in, Elena Vega stood tall, not as a soldier, not as a ghost of war, but as the unbroken silence that would never fade. The signal had left the mountain like a blade of light through endless dark, carrying her truth into the skies. Long after Elena Vega's breath faltered, long after her knees buckled and her body slumped silently beside the beacon, the world beyond began to change. Her story did not end where she fell, it began. Far away, in command centers lit by cold screens and endless calculations, officers stared in stunned silence as the transmission broke through interference and encrypted layers. Her voice had carried across the static, brief, strained, but unmistakable. "This is Vega, we held the line, tell them we fought, tell them we mattered." The final packet of data followed. Coordinates, images of the battlefield, proof of atrocities committed, evidence of sacrifice. The truth they had tried to bury was now unshakable. No one in that room spoke. No one dared. Some lowered their eyes, ashamed. Others clenched fists, haunted. All of them knew the weight of what they had received. And beyond the sterile halls of command, the signal spread further. News feeds carried it. Broadcasts repeated it. Faces across the globe and far beyond watched shaky footage of smoke rising from the valley, of a lone woman standing against the flood. They heard her broken whisper, felt the steel in her silence. Mothers wept. Fathers straightened their shoulders. Children clutched their toys and asked questions no parent could answer. The world had been drowning in apathy, war fatigue, and lies. But this was different. This was not a statistic or another faceless casualty. This was a story, a face, a sacrifice that whispered across every heart it touched. In villages scarred by conflict, old men gathered the young around firelight and spoke her name like a prayer. In crowded cities, workers paused, their machines still, screens glowing with her last stand. In quiet homes, strangers pressed hands over their hearts, not knowing why their chest ached so deeply for someone they had never met. And in military barracks, hardened soldiers sat in silence, heads bowed. They had lost comrades, buried friends, but this felt different. This felt like a reminder of why they had ever lifted a rifle in the first place. Elena Vega had become more than a soldier. She had become a mirror. Time did not erase her. Months passed, seasons shifted. The war raged on, but the tide had turned, not through overwhelming firepower, not through some sudden miracle, but through belief. Her transmission had become the spark. Forces that had been crumbling with doubt now stood taller. Broken alliances mended. Civilians who had given up began to resist. And everywhere, painted on walls, etched into stone, whispered in song, 3 words endured. Tell them we mattered. Years later, a child stood at the base of the mountain, where the final battle had been fought. The ruins had been cleared, the valley green again, wildflowers blooming where craters once burned. But the beacon remained, a monument now, plated in steel and carved with names of the fallen. At its heart, a single figure stood eternal, the likeness of a woman, rifle slung across her back, gaze steady on the horizon. The child tugged at her father's sleeve. "Papa, who is she?" The man's throat tightened. His hand rested on the monument, tracing the etched letters of her name. "She was someone who chose us over herself," he whispered. "Someone who gave her silence so the rest of us could have voices." The child tilted her head, eyes wide. "Did she win?" The father paused, the wind carrying the smell of grass and earth. Slowly he nodded. "Yes, she won in every way that matters." Historians would write her story in books. Artists would paint her last stand in colors of fire and shadow. Songs would rise, her name carried across generations like a hymn. But the truth was simpler than all of that. Elena Vega had not fought for glory. She had not dreamed of monuments or songs. She had fought because people were behind her, wounded, frightened, clinging to life. She had fought because silence was the last gift she had left to give. And that was enough to make her eternal. In the quiet of night, survivors who had once huddled in the ruins remembered her not as a statue, but as the woman who smiled at them in the valley, telling them to stay low and stay alive. They carried her memory not like a wound, but like a compass, because she had shown them what it meant to endure. On the anniversary of her final stand, people gathered not in grief but in reverence. Lanterns floated into the sky, glowing like stars, each carrying a whispered name of someone lost. And among them always was hers. Some spoke it aloud, others whispered it under their breath. But every heart that remembered her carried a piece of her silence forward. The galaxy is vast, wars will come and go, heroes will rise and fall, but few leave behind a silence so heavy, so sacred, that it binds generations. Elena Vega's silence was not emptiness. It was full of sacrifice, of memory, of unspoken love for the people she would never meet, the lives she would never see. And in that fullness, in that quiet beyond words, her sacrifice never ended. Some say they can still hear it in the wind that sweeps across the mountain, a whisper, faint but steady. Not of sorrow, not of despair, but of promise. A promise that she had mattered, that they all mattered, and that silence, once born of sacrifice, would never fade.